Start by reading the prompt. Quote, Marxism is a form of cognition sui generis. Gillian Rose, Hegel Contra Sociology. The 20th century saw the objective disintegration of the coherence of Marxism within the history of modernity. Now, 10 years into the Trump era and its reconsolidation of world politics, Marxism seemed more obscure than ever as a way of thinking about the world or the possibility of changing it. In this context, Platypus asked the untimely question, what is Marxism? Does it matter in the 21st century? Do we still need Marx today? Why? Why in the past have people invoked Marx? Why did they refer to themselves as Marxists? Do we need Marx to understand capitalism? Do we need Marx to understand capitalist politics? How is Marxism useful to the left for articulating the task of freedom? What kind of potential is it? What kind of potential is it possible to find in the objective conditions of the present? Is an immanent critique of capitalism necessary? Finally, what kind of problem is it that we find ourselves in today? Is it possible to leave Marx behind or to go beyond Marx? I will now introduce our speakers in the order they will speak in. First, we have Paul North. Paul North is Maurice Yainson Professor of German at Yale, where he teaches critical theory, emphasizing Jewish thought and emancipatory strains in the history of philosophy. He is the co-editor of the New English edition of Marx's Capital, Volume 1. Second, we have Liz Rathburn of Freedom Road Socialist Organization. Liz Rathburn is a 23-year-old cadre member of the Freedom Road Socialist Organization. Rathburn joined FRSO when they were 17, at the height of the George Floyd rebellion in 2020. Along with spending 4 years in the student movement, organizing at UIC, Rathburn also helped organize the march on the 2024 Democratic National Convention. Today, they are a rank-and-file Teamster activist with Local 705 and work unloading cargo planes at O'Hare Airport. Next, we have Andrea Bauer. Andrea Bauer, born in Elgin, Illinois, moved to Seattle in 1980. She is the national secretary of the Freedom Socialist Party at its headquarters there, and also writes and edits for the party's newspaper, The Freedom Socialist. Then we have Benjamin Studebaker. Benjamin Studebaker holds a PhD in Politics and International Studies from the University of Cambridge. His new book, Legitimacy in Liberal Democracies, will be available in paperback next month for under $25. And finally, we have John Garvey. John Garvey has been active in radical politics for more than 50 years. In the mid-90s, he was the founding editor of Race Trader. In 2010 or thereabouts, he was a founding editor of Insurgent Notes. Since 2016, he has been a member of the editorial group of Hardcrackers. He also edited with David Ranney, The Long 60s, Conversations with a Lifelong Revolutionary, Lauren Goldner, which was published earlier this year. So we will start with 7 to 9 minutes of opening remarks, then short responses to the opening remarks, and then I will open up to Q&A. So, Mr. North, please go ahead.
On your marks, get set, go. Hi, everybody. I'm really happy to be here. I don't know if I'll be happy after this panel. It depends how much pushback I get. I think I'm probably the nerdiest person on the panel, but we'll see. So my nerdism goes right to Marx's Capital, which I spent the last 10 years working on. If I were to answer to the question, what do we need from Marx today? More than anything, I would say we need the Capital Project. Not for antiquarian reasons, but to help us see the system and to help find a way out from it. You could quote Margaret Thatcher here, as you can often, there is no alternative. Unfortunately, there's no alternative, but if one of you wants to produce the real capital for the 21st century, please do. In order to get something from capital today, you have to see it as a training ground for doing analysis of the capital system and critique and also to understand how Marx, as he was writing it, all however many thousands of pages, adjusted his own theories. So none of it is really definitive. In fact, all the way to the end of his life, he was waiting for information from studies of business cycles, from people who were taking data from capitalism. There wasn't a lot of good data on capitalism, and Marx was waiting for it to see how he would modify his theories. I'm going to give 4 big what we needs from Marx's analysis and critique today. Are you ready? Number 1, the automatic subject. This comes from volume 1 in chapter 4, and it teaches us how capital is a metastable system that is its own historical subject and takes human beings and elements of nature into its machine-like grasp and makes them do things. It's true that he develops Ricardo's idea of value and gives a name to it, which he takes from Ricardo, but he develops the theory, surplus value. He gives this surplus value a political meaning, how it's wrung out of workers. He also unmasks fetishes of the commodity, of labor, and of interest. But the question is, why can't we stop it? Why can't we stop it by rational means? Why can't we stop it by average organizing? Why can't we stop it by simply not going to work? And the answer to this is the automatic subject, which I'm happy to talk about more. The automatic subject, as I say, makes every human being and their life into a mask of one of its functions. This is how Marx presents it. That's number 1, the automatic subject. We really need that to understand capital today. Number 2, we need, from volume 2, a demanding time space. How many of you have read volume 2? Don't lie. Yeah, okay. That's right. That was honest. Well, our new translation is on its way. Not that that will make it less dry, but really I think it's the theoretically most exciting volume. It tells you why space and time have new coordinates altogether. For example, space is not about geographical space or some sort of Newtonian empty space, but about where 3 circuits of capital touch: finance, valorization, and production. There's a new sense of contiguity where those things touch. And physical space, geographical space, has to be collapsed one way or the other, technologically, all sorts of ways, to make it fit capital's space needs. Time, as you'll learn in volume 2, is turnover time, and that has all sorts of consequences for the way we live. The first 4 chapters of volume 2, this is not an advertisement for buying our translation, but it is a push to read volume 2 as soon as you can. The first 4 chapters of volume 2 teach you how the circuits of money, commodities, and production come into contact with each other in peculiar ways and bring near a market, a factory floor, and a bank. It doesn't matter where they are on the earth, but they are the nearest things that we have when they touch. It teaches you how capital has to pass through what Marx calls these different forms of existence: money, commodities, and means of production. It has to go in a certain order, and it has to go without obstacles. This is how space has to be organized. And you can see when a strait like the Strait of Hormuz is closed, how this impinges on the physical world. But it's not actually a physical issue. The next 10 or so chapters talk about time and how time changes. Time equals the number of turnovers of a certain quantity of capital in a certain unit of calendar time. The consequence of turnover time is clock time and the way we experience the rush and the pressures to get to work. It's not the other way around, according to Marx. When a certain quantity of capital returns, increased to its starting point, that's a turnover. We need to understand from volume 2 the new time and space. From volume 3, we need to understand Marx's stub of a finance theory. He talks about finance as a fictitious element, something that is separate from the real economy. I think it's better to talk about finance as a fetish, and that's a stronger position of critique. And Marx hints at this, but really sticks with the fictitious label for finance. That's something that really needs to be developed, the fetish of finance, the finance fetish. And the last thing we need from Marx, so we need, what was it? We need the automatic subject. We need the new time space. We need the fetish of finance. All these things will help us understand our present and find our way out of it. And finally, we need what Deleuze called Marx's grandeur. This is another reason why there is no alternative, at least until you produce it. Marx aspires to do these three aspects all at once, which makes him really grand. To be theoretically ruthless, to be critically polemical, and to be an organizational genius. And he never gives up on any one of those. In theory, he has a drive to understand the whole complex with no exceptions, and this, as he calls in an early letter, is ruthless. He does critique, and he uses his polemical attitude to tear down. There's only one person he never tore down. Do you know who that person is? Engels, exactly. Everyone else, in writing. And the third element of Marx's grandeur is organizing. That is to say, he had a participatory and constructive spirit in organizing. He was hell against theorists. But in organizing, he wanted everyone to be involved the best way they could, and he tried to engineer his speeches and his organizing plans so that their real interests would be represented. Those are the four things. Going backwards, his grandeur, the concept of finance, the space-time, and the first one was the automatic subject. And that is like 9 minutes. Thanks.
Right on.
Thank you.
I really liked it. Anyway.
Oh, thanks.
Hey y'all, I'm Liz. I'm with Freedom Road. And I didn't realize we only had 9 minutes when I was writing this. So when we're at 2 minutes before it's over, throw something at me, okay? All right. So, sorry about this. First I want to thank Platypus for their confounding prompt. I regret I'll only be able to tackle part of it. So for my purposes, I want to answer two questions. First, why is Marx essential for revolutionaries? And what are the tasks of revolutionary Marxists in the 21st century? I hope you'll bear with me for a quote that I'm pretty sure we've all heard before, and maybe at this very conference. Philosophers have hitherto only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it. I start here because to me, at its core, Marxism is the science of revolution. Marx and Engels were not just philosophers, but revolutionaries, informed by their practice within an international revolutionary movement. From the publishing of the Manifesto to Engels mounting the barricades in '48 to Marx winning a central place in the First International, they set out to guide revolutionaries from Europe to the United States out of utopian schemes and into the mass movements, specifically the workers' movement. This was because Marx understood that it is not a moral injustice that makes the working class so crucial for advancing socialism, advancing history. Instead, it is that objectively existing exploitation, that irreconcilable contradiction between social production and private accumulation. He saw clear as day that the working class has a unique historic task of abolishing itself and all classes with it, freeing humanity. In other words, Marx and Engels didn't think it would be just journalists and students that would usher in a new world, but the broad masses of the proletariat. They didn't think this was a pie-in-the-sky vision or a moral aim that would be carried forward by great men, but an objective process that had already begun. That process did not stop when Marx passed, as capital concentrated into monopolistic firms and cartels conquered political power. The contradiction between competitive industrial capitalism and monopoly capitalism has played out. We are living under imperialism, monopoly capitalism. I know imperialism is a dirty word here, but it's the facts. This imperialist era, has seen the world divided between imperialist powers who have not just brutally colonized one part of the world but have laid themselves out over the entire globe. It's in this era, the one that we were lucky enough to be born into, that the working class is finally going to take power into their hands through socialist revolution. In the Soviet Union, in China, and dozens of other countries around the world, the working class has taken command before and can take command again. In our view, Marx cannot be productively separated from the science of revolution he helped to forge, including the advances made since his death. In FRSO, it is our view that those revolutions represented a massive leap forward for the international proletariat. The path of Lenin, Stalin, and Mao is still the clearest path forward. Marxism, particularly Marxism-Leninism, has proven its worth not just on the page, but on the front lines of the class struggle, as a method of thought and guide to action. But what does that actually mean? Because you can look all over the world, and even at this table, and find parties diametrically opposed, all claiming Marxism-Leninism. Let's look at the world situation. Mao had a saying, "Everything under heaven is chaos. The situation is excellent." The past century saw the United States become the overwhelmingly dominant imperialist power on the world stage. World War II saw, alongside a progressive and anti-fascist people's war, an inter-imperialist conflict that ground up millions of lives to redivide the world. When the dust settled, America, its Bretton Woods system, and its international alliances and institutions had conquered the globe. While the Cold War is outside of the scope of this panel, it's also clear that the US entered a relative decline after the end of that Bretton Woods system. While the brief mirage of stability returned after the fall of the Soviet Union, that was hollowed out by revisionism and besieged by imperialism. The division of Eastern Europe's spoils was not a permanent fix to capitalist instability. Across the globe, America is facing new challenges to its hegemony, from the inter-imperialist war in Russia to the resistance in Iran, Palestine, and the Middle East more broadly, to even Europe, where the once happily subservient EU is finding itself increasingly squeezed by its American allies. Trump, for all his particular nastiness, is both a cause and a symptom of this decline. The ruling class struggles to rule in the old way and has to fall back on a more openly violent, repressive, and imperialist method to hold on to power. Trump is not a sign of strength, but a sign of weakness. So, I've just said a lot about imperialism, but to borrow a classic platypusism, what does this have to do with the working class? So, the working class. Revolution in our lifetimes is not just possible, but achievable. Socialist revolution, proletarian revolution. So, with what? It's not us in this room, it's not a trade union, it's a party. The basic method of organization that has worked before and can work again. The advanced detachment of the working class, organized into an ironclad and disciplined fighting organization. One that contains the best leaders of the working class and the mass movements. But today there is no party organization which meets those scientific criteria for a communist party. That means that our task today is long, patient, arduous work. And that work is to bring Marxism to the working class, to fuse the socialist movement with the workers' movement, arming the masses who make society run with the scientific understanding of how it can be changed to run for them. But with who? For us, we need a strategic alliance. That's what we believe. Look, this is kind of also outside the scope of this panel. Freedom Road believes that the United States is a prison house of nations based on the objective historical development of a lot of its stuff. You can ask me about this later, okay? But for our purposes, there are two great forces in the United States, the oppressed nations and the multinational working class. The oppressed nationality movements have clearly shown again and again, thank you, brother, have clearly shown again and again their potential for mass revolutionary mobilization and change. On the other hand, the working class, not siloed off by nationality, but mixed together in the common process of production, also has an objective interest in revolution. Just as opposing imperialism, fighting for self-determination, gives an objective interest in revolution, so does class exploitation here in the United States. So, in our view, to build this, Marxists need to be shoulder to shoulder with people in the struggle, able to sum up failures and success with the credibility of practice and organization. We need to change people's minds on a mass scale, not one by one, but by the thousands. This moment demands Marxists break from the unhealthy traditions of abstaining from impure mass struggle. That means building mass organizations, united not in ideas, but in action, to meet and elevate those immediate felt wants and needs of the class. Today, tens, maybe even hundreds of thousands of people in the United States are taking up socialist ideas. Millions are taking to the streets. The conditions for building a new communist party are excellent, and no one is going to do it for us. And the working class is not alone in its fight with the monopoly capitalists. From the resistance in Iran and Palestine, to the socialist states in Cuba, China, Vietnam, Korea, and Laos, progressive governments in countries like Latin America, or countries like Venezuela, the multinational working class in this country is objectively aligned with the majority of the world. So, we've got a world to win, and we're on the road to it. That's what I got.
Oh, I think I need the microphone. That's all right. I think so. So I'm Andrea, and I want to thank Platypus very much for inviting me to this weekend in this panel. I am a product originally of the New Left of the 1970s, who came to socialism and Marxism after a stint wandering in the political wilds. And when I encountered the Freedom Socialist Party in 1980, I started to get my real political education. I am very glad to be here this afternoon with everyone, and I'm glad to have been part of the discussion so far. The title of this panel is, How Does Marxism Matter in the 21st Century? But I think the underlying question that we're being asked is, does Marxism still matter? Honestly, I think the number of forums devoted to the question of whether Marx still matters over the past 10 or 20 or 100 years is kind of proof in and of itself that the answer is yes. My simplest answer to the question is that you don't have socialism that means anything without Marxism, without Marx's dialectical and historical materialism and his critique of capitalism, and his record alongside Engels of actual working class organizing, which Liz referred to. And as Liz said, to paraphrase, as Marx famously said, the purpose of studying and understanding the world is to change it. We don't want what we have. And by the way, when I talk about Marxism, I'm incorporating the work of Engels as well. The introduction to the topic this afternoon posits the objective disintegration of the coherence of Marxism during the 20th century. Actually, I don't believe the coherence of Marxism has disintegrated, and it doesn't seem to me that Marxism is more obscure than ever as a way of thinking about the world or changing it. Clearly, people who consider themselves socialists or leftists have many different ideas about what Marxism means. They may think they have improved it by ditching some of its basic ideas, or they may have rejected it entirely in favor of something they think takes the place of Marxism. But to me, that doesn't mean that Marxism itself is no longer a coherent philosophy, and yes, even a battle plan to an extent. It gives us the foundation for creating a better world through workers' revolution. Marx laid bare the actual workings of capitalism, as John, right, or Paul, as Paul said and as he has written about. And in doing so, he was building on the work of previous thinkers and using the methodology of dialectical and historical materialism. I think his analysis holds up today. If it did not, there wouldn't be so many attacks on it still today by apologists for capitalism. I've had the opportunity over the years to study and to teach Marx's Capital. Two of his essential ideas were that capital tends to accumulate in fewer and fewer hands, while the working class is subject to increasing misery. Can this be doubted? The statistics and what we see with our own eyes says no. The top 1% of Americans hold almost a third of all US household wealth. Elon Musk is richer than half of the people in this country combined. When it comes to the idea of increasing working class misery, this might be harder for people to see, especially in urban areas in the United States, even if they do have to step around homeless people sleeping on the sidewalk on their way to school or work. But it is not hard to see if you look at the international picture, especially sub-Saharan Africa, or even at Native American reservations in rural areas here in the United States. Something like 700 million people on the planet live in extreme poverty, and wealth inequality just keeps growing. Maybe it is hard to see the coherence of Marxism because it is a living thing. It's not static. How could it be? History is not static. Conditions change, and our understanding of them has to change with them. Building on Marx's analysis of socialism and his dialectical method, Marxism has become enriched over time. And of course, there are wide and often very vocal disagreements about what Marxism really is, and about which innovations have added to the original body of ideas and which have sold them out, while still claiming to be Marxist. Maybe that is what Platypus means by the failure of the coherence of Marxism. I want to mention a few of the enrichments that I see. First of all is what Lenin brought to the struggle. His analysis of imperialism as the highest form of capitalism explained the rise of finance capital and what that means for owners and workers in our age. It showed how the inevitable division of the world into colonies and spheres of influence led to the rise of a reactionary labor aristocracy in the wealthier countries, which we very much have to contend with in the United States today. He developed the understanding of why a vanguard party is necessary for successful workers' revolution. What's more, he put theory into practice and led the first actual workers' revolution taking state power. And this is where Liz and I part ways on our analysis of the historical development of Marxism and the movements that arose from it. Leon Trotsky developed the theory of permanent revolution, which is a term first used by Marx. In shorthand, these were the ideas that in his time and ours, in the ebb tide of capitalism, democratic demands can only be won by going all the way to socialism. Second, that the revolution does not end with the taking of power, but continues with all kinds of class conflicts, debates, and new questions to answer as the new society moves forward. And finally, that socialism can only be achieved on a world scale, given the globalized economy and the international division of labor and resources. Trotsky also led the theoretical way forward in the fights against Stalinism and fascism. The last thing I will mention in discussing how Marxism has expanded is the revolutionary socialist feminism brought to the table by the FSP's own founders and earliest members. One way of seeing socialist feminism is that it brings a deeper understanding of the role of special oppression in relationship to class struggle. Women's liberation is as universal and fundamental a struggle for basic democratic rights as you can imagine. Capitalism has proved it cannot deliver on this basic right. To achieve it means a fight for socialism. All of these advances I have mentioned built on Marxism. They didn't throw it out. And they were advances made by activists who were also intellectuals, but not academics or only academics. They combined theory and practice. They synthesized. One of the other questions posed to us is, what kind of potential is it possible to find in the objective conditions of the present? I think the conditions of the present are overflowing with potential. As Trotsky said in the transitional program, the material conditions for realizing socialism are not only ripe, they are somewhat rotten. And that was nearly 100 years ago. The contradictions of capitalism have strained to the breaking point. The worldwide wealth gap, the inability of capitalism to meet even basic human needs across the planet, the climate crisis, the new wars that threaten to become world wars, all these things and the resistance that continually boils over in response are the objective conditions that point to the inevitability of change. The question is, what kind of change? And that is where the left comes in. As somebody remarked in a workshop earlier, Trotsky also pointed out in the transitional program that the crisis of the proletariat in our time is the crisis of its leadership. So then we come to Lenin's question, what is to be done? I think the left has a serious obligation to try to answer this question and to act on it, especially the left in the United States, whose ruling class and government are the direct cause of so much misery around the world. I think one part of this answer is that the left has to become better at working together. This was touched on in the previous panel that I was part of quite a bit. We do not have to become instant best friends. We don't have to change our programs to suit one another, but we have to be able to work with each other to provide radical leadership in the movements, including the labor movement. We have to be able to form united fronts together against war, against racism and police violence, for reproductive freedom and bodily autonomy, against ICE, and in self-defense, to defend our own rights, to protest and to be radical. Out of this, hopefully, can come prospects for revolutionary left regroupment. Some of the things that keep left groups apart are fundamental, but maybe not so many things as we think. The left cannot grow through recruitment alone. We need also to start looking for points of commonality that we can build on. To the question of whether Marxism still matters, I say an unqualified yes. The question now is, how can we make what we do matter?
Is this thing on? Is it on now?
Yep.
There we go. To answer today's question, I have to use some abstractions. To use an abstraction, you have to conceptualize it to give it some particular meaning. This is a dangerous business. When we make something universal into something particular, or something abstract into something concrete, we have to limit it to our terrain, and that means we have to mutilate it a little bit. But if we don't do this, we can't use concepts at all, and we need to use concepts to be able to act in a thoughtful way. So I must ask the muses to forgive me for the sins I am about to commit. Sometimes you have to step away from God, but always in his service. Let's start with the abstraction of Marxism. I find it helpful to conceptualize Marxism as a tradition of thinking about how to overcome the limits of capitalism from within those limits. It remains relevant so long as there are people who remain within capitalism, are conscious of its limits, and are motivated to try to overcome them. Now, what about the abstraction of capitalism? It might help to think of capitalism as a system in which social life revolves around wage labor. If you are a wage laborer, or in education or training to become a wage laborer, you are considered to be contributing to society. It is also okay to be self-employed, and it is more than okay to be a job creator. But if you are, as the kids say, neat, if your income comes from what appears to be a mysterious ontological source, you are considered despicable or mentally ill. Okay, so then what about the abstraction of a limit? Let us say, just for now, that wage laborers experience the limits of capitalism directly. Their labor time generates an enormous amount of wealth and power, but they never get to possess much wealth or exercise much power. Indeed, because they spend so much of their time performing specialized wage labor, they are unable to develop their intellectual and creative capacities. Over time, they become narrowed and emptied by the performance of wage labor, their human potential slowly atrophying until their dried up husks can be dumped in first a nursing home and then an incinerator. Wage laborers do not need to be told that this is the case. They are perfectly capable of recognizing that they are in this situation, at least in the beginning. But once they decide that there is no alternative to this situation, they start coping and seething. They argue that wage labor is natural, or that it's what God wants them to do. God used to want them to be peasants, but never mind all that. Can't be hateful, gotta be grateful, can't be hateful. And then there are others who tell themselves that they are Knuff, that when they have sex, eat food, watch videos, or wear a jumper with some name on it, they are constructing an identity. If you have nothing substantive to believe in, you have to think in one of these two ways, or you'll kill yourself. You will, I'm not kidding. So while Marxism involves articulating the limits of capitalism, this is not the most important thing Marxism does. It's the bit where you try to overcome the limits that's most important. This is where Marxism runs into trouble. There doesn't seem to be a working class that is conscious of itself as a class anymore. Without a working class, how can there be a will of labor that can be articulated by a political party or labor movement? Without a will of labor, what can oppose the will of capital? If capital is unopposed, why should it go to the trouble of articulating a unitary will? Why shouldn't capitalists struggle against one another on the basis of their sectoral interests? If there is no longer any contradiction between a will of capital and a will of labor, why would the state need to articulate a class compromise? Would politics not become something entirely different, something that can be described in conceptual schemes derived from Rousseau and Kant, with only a very limited efficacy? If it no longer helps us to overcome the limits of capitalism to think in these inherited terms, why go on thinking in them? What good do they do? To deal with this new situation, academics have, for decades, increasingly understood Marxism as a tradition rather than a worldview. It may help to conceptualize these two abstractions in such a way that they appear clearly distinct from one another. Suppose we think of a worldview as a comprehensive doctrine, something that gives you a bunch of names and definitions you can memorize and chain together so that you feel like you know how things work. The thing is, we don't know how things work. If we did, we would be making clear, demonstrable progress toward overcoming the limits of capitalism. But no one is making clear, demonstrable progress. On the contrary, it seems everyone is getting narrower and emptier all the time, agreeing about less and less. On the other hand, let us treat an intellectual tradition as something more modest, as a long-term project that over time gives rise to many distinct instantiations of itself. Each of these instantiations tries to fulfill the tradition's aim. An iteration of Marxism is a limited theory about how, in a specific situation, we might be able to progress toward overcoming the limits of capitalism. Why are iterations of Marxism limited? Because we ourselves are always already limited, if not by our little monkey skull, then at least by capitalism. Too much of your time is always already posited as labor time. Even your education and training always already focus too much on preparing you for the labor market. Your parents have talked to you too much about the fact that one day you may need to get a job. They've already made you think about it far too much. So you have already failed to become what you might have been. The most you can do is develop a limited theory and have a go. But you see, there's something of a catch-22 here. If a tradition must be around for a long time, this implies that its aim is never fulfilled by any of its instantiations. Uh-oh. They all fall short of the tradition's purpose. A tradition might therefore be something of a contradiction. To exist, it can never quite exist. If Marxism is a tradition, it is something that has never quite managed to live up to itself. People don't like to feel inadequate. As people spend more and more time in the labor force without achieving anything politically or socially, they get narrower and emptier, and they lose the ability to think properly. They grow resentful and bitter, and they comfort themselves by adopting worldviews that make them feel enough. If we don't overcome the limits of capitalism, we become defined by those limits. Marxists who don't succeed in overcoming capitalism fail not just to overcome capitalism, but also to overcome the limits capitalism imposes on their own ability to think. Marxism, then, is a tradition of limited theories about overcoming limits. Isn't that a bit depressing? By itself, Marxism is not enough. If all you've got is Marxism, all you do is think about limits all the time. You need something that gives you the fortitude to stick with Marxism, to be resilient in the face of failure. And that something can't be a worldview, because a worldview will make you too proud to think properly. What you need is a conviction that overcoming the limits of capitalism is, in some very serious way, good. Now, what is the good? Well, we can't say really, because the good is what is beyond the limits, and what is beyond the limits cannot be grasped from within them. It can only be gestured at, pointed toward. We have some sense that we would be better people if the bulk of our time were not posited as labor time, but we cannot say exactly what we would be like, because until we overcome the limits, our ability to think remains limited by them. There have been a few Marxists who have been able to teach this. Although all Marxists have offered iterations of Marxism, most have offered their iterations as worldviews, failing to pass along their own intellectual virtue. I would sooner teach you nothing of Marxism than hand you a set of prefabricated concepts. Abstractions are not mere trinkets to to be grabbed and rubbed and fastened to the front of your jumper like pieces of flair. They are the muses, and the muses will not speak to you if you would make servants of them. Can you accept this answer, or do you already need a worldview? Is it already that bad? We'll find out.
Wow. I always have that problem, sorry. So I have two questions that I think are appropriate. They're a little bit different than the ones posed in the prompt. First is, who was Marx? Who is Marx, not in terms of the details of his biography rather, but who was Marx that's relevant to our concerns today? Sorry. And then what should Marxism be? And depending on how quickly I read, I might get to both of them in this first remarks. I may have to wait for some of it. I explored some of the ideas I'll be putting forward today in a 2018 article for a special issue of Insurgent Notes devoted to Where Was Marx in 1968. I argued that a different Marx reading than what prevailed, at least at that time, had been needed. Let me make clear that I was not at all interested in the frequently recurring fashionable idea that Marx needed to be improved on. Instead, I was talking about the potential of a sustained engagement with the rich complexity of Marx's writings and life's work. I offered the following suggestions. I believe that all of them could have been undertaken in 1968 with the resources available at that time, and indeed there were small currents within Marxism that were doing what I advocated. They were simply not the Marxists that mattered. I am not suggesting that different readings of Marx would have allowed us to avoid the evaporation of the upsurges of 1968, but I do think that they would have allowed us to build a political project that would have been far better prepared to fight against the sustained capitalist offensive that was launched in the early 1970s and to avoid some of the worst political dead ends that have dominated far too much of radical and revolutionary politics in the years since. So this is my who was Marx? Marx was a critic of those revolutionaries who wished to seize state power on behalf of others. The approaches provided by the Bolsheviks and their various Bolshevik-inspired offshoots, even those who present themselves as critics of Stalinism and Maoism, the Trotskyists, only distorted Marx. The endless invocation of Marx as an authority for the justification of what were simply dreadful exercises in the brutal implementation of capitalist accumulation in different national contexts placed Marx's contribution to a human emancipation in mortal danger. It's of course it's not possible to challenge them within their own terms of reference, in no small part because they lied about matters small and large. But it is possible to challenge them by returning to Marx's own writings. Second, Marx was a revolutionist opposed to sectarianism. In his introduction to the collection of documents from the First International, Marcelo Musto commented about Marx's role in the organization. Contrary to later fantasies that pictured Marx as the founder of the International, he was not even among the organizers of that meeting at St. Martin's Hall. He sat in a non-speaking capacity on the platform, he recalled in a letter to his friend Engels. Yet he immediately grasped the potential in the event and worked hard to ensure that the new organization successfully carried out its mission. He was appointed to the 34-member standing committee, where he soon gained sufficient trust to be given the task of writing the inaugural address and the provisional statutes of the International. In these fundamental texts, as in many others that followed, Marx drew on the best ideas of the various components of the International, while at the same time eliminating corporatist inclinations and sectarian tones. He firmly linked economic and political struggle to each other and made international thinking and international action an irreversible choice. One aspect of his effectiveness was his ability to draw upon the findings of his theoretical investigations to arrive at valuable political insights and to communicate them to others. In the version of Value, Price, and Profit that Marx delivered in 2 speeches to the International General Council in June of 1865, he wrote, The very development of modern industry must progressively turn the scale in favor of the capitalist against the working man, and consequently the general tendency of capitalistic production is not to raise but to sink the average standard of wages, or to push the value of labor more or less to its minimum limit. Such being the tendency of things in this system, is this saying that the working class ought to renounce their resistance against the encroachments of capital and abandon their attempts at making the best of the occasional chances for their temporary improvement? If they did, they would be degraded to one level of broken wretches past salvation. I'm going to skip a bit. At the same time, and quite apart from the general servitude involved in the wages system, the working class ought not to exaggerate to themselves the ultimate working of these everyday struggles. They ought not to forget that they are fighting with effects, but not with the causes of those effects, that they are retarding the downward movement, but not changing its direction, that they are applying palliatives, not curing the malady. They ought therefore not to be exclusively absorbed in these unavoidable guerrilla fights incessantly springing up from the never-ceasing encroachments of capital or changes of the market. They ought to understand that with all the miseries it imposes upon them, the present system simultaneously engenders the material conditions and the social forms necessary for an economical restructuring of society. Instead of the conservative motto, a fair day's wage for a fair day's work, they ought to inscribe on their banner the revolutionary watchword, abolition of the wages system. Next, Marx was the author of a critique of political economy. My guess is that most people in this room know that. In 1968, and even now, Capital often continues to be read straight, as if it were intended to be a social science textbook. Every claim that Marx put forward is assumed to be a statement of what he thinks, even when, in footnotes or subsequent paragraphs, he makes clear to an attentive reader that he believes nothing of the sort. Some remarkable Marx readers have taught us to do otherwise. Nicole Pepperell, for example, from Australia, has concluded more or less that they got it all wrong. In numerous articles and her dissertation, Pepperell provided numerous insights into the ways in which Marx's complex thinking became manifest in Volume 1. Marx intends Capital as a sustained critique of the epistemologies of ignorance manifested in political economic theory. For Marx, political economy actively produces and foregrounds knowledge of all dimensions of capitalism that can be readily identified with the realm of personal autonomy and with power legitimately wielded only through the informed consent of all social actors. At the same, this is political economy, it aggressively manufactures and encourages the spread of a fundamental ignorance of the other equally central dimensions of capitalist production. Hard power dimensions of the reproduction of capital on a global scale are thus treated as unfortunate exceptions to the enlightened norm. Relentlessly, Marx's text progressively demonstrates how the major vector for the contemporary production of barbarism lies not in some savage margin, but right in the heart of the industrial core. And yet, the overall structure of Marx's text remains poorly understood. The nature of its object, a system of knowledge that actively produces ignorance, has proven remarkably resilient in taming and redirecting the force of Marx's work. I'll skip a bit. Next, Marx at his heart was a fighter for human emancipation. He quotes, this is still Pepperell, but it was only the dialectics, the method of thought, that was of service to him. As for the viewpoint itself, it seems to us that Marx already here, as he stood up for the freedom of the press and the right of poor peasants to gather wood freely in the forest, rather imposed his own point of view on the Hegelian philosophy of law and the state, then derived his point of view from it. It was first and foremost, as Mehring, an important German social democrat himself said, the deep and true sympathy that Marx felt for the politically and socially deprived masses. It was the heart that drove him already in his idealist stage into the struggle and determined the side that he took in. We didn't need Marx's catechisms in 1968. We don't need them now. They do not provide a way into Marx. They provide a way out. And when I return, I'll talk about Marxism, the next chapter, the next installment, okay? I'll stop there.
So now we will go into a set of brief responses, and starting with you, Margaret.
There's a lot to say. Maybe just taking up John's insight and connecting it to Liz's position. How to do theory and organizing with a deep sympathy for the people on whose behalf you're doing the organizing. Whether you belong to them or not in the day, in the evening when you're doing organizing is a different activity, just like doing theory. So I want to ask maybe both of you how you think it's possible to drive your decisions in organizing, writing history, doing theory from this feeling of standing shoulder to shoulder, as you said, or the sympathy for workers that Marx had. How does that change the whole equation?
Well, I'll say, when I say shoulder to shoulder, what I mean is very practically working alongside people as they, and I like how John put it, engage in those sort of spontaneous guerrilla struggles within capitalism and imperialism. We have to be there, not just at a Marxist conference, but at the No Kings protest. We have to be there at every single picket line. We have to be there in the workplace. We have to be there working shoulder to shoulder with people so that they give a damn what we say. Because, frankly, if you've not been fighting alongside me, I don't care what you have to say, really. And why would any of them care what you have to say? So, get that actual basis in credible organizing, I guess. Yeah, John. Oh, or wait, I guess we don't have to pass it. Yeah,
Is it, Paul, you want me to address that as well?
You can, I don't know, it's what came to mind.
I guess I'll just say one thing, is that, so I've been active politically since 1969. Before that, I did liberal politics, which are, a story, but not worth considering. Although my biography that Natalie prepared listed mostly all the editorial things I had done, that was not the primary way in which I identified myself. I was an activist in a whole variety of different settings. For 8 years, I drove a taxi in New York. I was part of a rank and file coalition and did many, many things, worked on matters of resistance to South African apartheid, certainly of racism in the city of New York, and kind of a whole variety of different things. My kind of theoretical work was basically nighttime work. It was what I did when I was not doing that, or when I was not actually working to make a living, which I did mostly working at the City University of New York. And I think, though, that it's, kind of one of the things that James Rose, CLR James Rose, I think in modern politics, was that, and he very much worked in that sense of Marxism as a tradition. And he eventually talked about it was not the task of revolutionaries to bring Marxism to the workers. It was rather the task of Marxists to learn from the workers, in his memorable phrase, to observe and record. Now, there were controversy about that, and perhaps he bent the stick too far, because he never really imagined that once you recorded that your work was done. He always actually remained a political activist. But that genuine appreciation for the innovation, for the inspiration, for the humanity of people at work, and not just narrowly people at work, the ordinary people of the world, whether they were people in Trinidad in his childhood, people in England when he was a cricket correspondent, people here in the United States when he came on a short-term visa to speak on behalf of Trotskyism and then stayed for 15 years. Then when he returned, when he was deported as an illegal alien of some sort, or kind of a suspect radical, returning to England and returning to Trinidad, wherever he found himself, He was always interested in learning from the people he encountered, and I think that we would all be well served to do that. Okay, I'll stop then.
Well, I agree very much with the idea of learning from people. I think in these times, there's really no excuse for the party to be separate from the workers and oppressed people that it is trying to organize. The party should be made up of and should reflect the working class. And I remember one of our founders, Claire Fraser, who started our newspaper, which I've been working on for a long time. She said the cover story should reflect, in general, what the majority of people in the United States, what's on the top of their mind. And I said, well, what about what the comrades are thinking about? And she said, well, the comrades should be thinking about the things that the majority of people are thinking about. So, hopefully in your party that there is not a schism between the two things, and you do want to meet and talk to as many people as possible and find out what they're thinking, what their problems are. It's an exchange of ideas. It's not just like going to school and opening up the top of your head and having the teacher pour the ideas into it. It's not that. It's an exchange.
I suppose in listening to the talks, I noticed that a lot of the focus in terms of what seems to people to be valuable about Marxism is the critique of capitalism or the description of capitalism, but there's less detailed focus on the politics, on Marx's own politics, as understood by Marx. And I wonder to what degree that part of the prompt has been taken up, how people feel about that part of the prompt. What about the politics? I like politics.
Would anybody like to respond to this question?
I wouldn't mind. I'm glad you asked that because the question of politics just came up on the panel. I think that what was said originally on the panel is that Marx was very non-sectarian in his organizing, but he had a point of view and he fought for it. In the First International and in its precursor, there was a lot of debate with the anarchists and the utopians. There was evolution in his thinking to the point where he said, you can't just reform the state once you take it over, you have to smash it, which was not his original position. And he very much felt the need for working class organization and participated in it. And I think that the impact he and Engels had in both practical organizing and in theory was immense.
Quick response. Well, I think to look at Marxism as a tradition, which is kind of like a basket of abstractions, I know that's a bit of a caricature. I wanted to say it ignores the side of Marxism and Marx's own practices and the idea of the critique of capital, which is to get to know what the people are doing, how they live, and what they want. So I take that to be political, in a sense what the other folks who've done a lot of organizing have said. So on the one hand, that is political. That's political in a kind of originary sense of the people are expressing their will, their experience, trying to find forms in which they can organize themselves. The best moment of that is in the critique of the Gotha program, in which Marx says, oh yeah, obviously the new politics will emerge from the way people organize and learn to know one another in overcoming capitalism.
Yeah, and I broadly agree with what both Paul and Andrea just said, but I'll just add that fundamentally, if we're going to take Marx seriously, we do have to take his fundamental goal seriously, and that is a political project. Even though I view Marxism as a science, I think that it finds real objective truths and has been advanced repeatedly in new eras. We are not living in 1848, we are not living in 1871, and to go back and try to draw out a beautiful Marxism out of that, I think is a project that, I think it was Marx who said that we have to let the past bury its own ideas, or something along those lines. Sorry, I'm a little loopy.
Bury its dead.
Thank you, bury its dead. Thank you, Paul. And I think part of that has to be burying the parts of Marxism that we can't use. If you can't use Marxism, if you can't go out and apply it, then it's not worth a damn. That's my view.
All right, let's open up to questions. Oh man. Let's go with Ethan.
Hi. I wanted to pick up on two things that were raised in the last things that you were just saying, Liz. First, that we're not necessarily living in 1848 or 1871, and second, like the applicability of Marxism. Just for the first half, like, can we say that definitively? Like, can we say that there have been there's been objective progress towards socialism, or the fulfillment of Marxism since, say, 1848? Like, can we say straightforwardly that there's been progress? And two, the usefulness of Marxism. Did Marx write solely, tactically? Like, is the core of Marxism, providing a guide for a workers' politics? Because it does seem like there is, a workers' politics, within capitalism. And maybe that also even has, the face of Marxism plastered onto it.
I like the question, and I'll say there's two questions here. So first, have we made progress towards Marxism? Not to sound like a broken record, but to quote Mao, fight, fail, fight again, fail again. We are in a long war here. To say that we have not made progress since 1848 when we have launched repeated socialist revolutions across the world, I think is, I don't know what else to call it except blindness. Blindness to the reality of our own era. We are not walking this path for the first time. We are walking it with the collected experiences of our class and of our movement. And then second, I don't just view Marxism as a tactical science. I think that it is a guide to thought and a guide to action. Obviously, look, I didn't have time to get into dialectical materialism and all of that. I was trying to be very specific, but yeah, Marxism is not just a way to be in the world, but a way to think about it, to understand it. And I do think, though, if you're not going out and trying to change the world with that understanding, then yeah, it's still not worth a damn.
That was close to the entirety of the...
Yeah, would anybody else like to answer that?
Okay. Well, I don't know how much progress has been made toward the accomplishment of actual socialism, the kind of socialism that Marx envisioned. There have been certainly advances around the world in attempts to make socialist revolutions, from which a lot can be learned. I think that part of your question was Marx, you know, just like a strategic or a tactical person putting out that kind of a thing. I think the genius of Marx is that he was both such a theoretician and such an activist, such a thinker about where we want to go and how. And in the Communist Manifesto, in the back of the Communist Manifesto, there's essentially a 10-point program for the communists of his day to organize around. And it's very interesting because some of the things that they organized around have been accomplished over time, sometimes many, many decades later, and some still remain to be accomplished. He wanted more for the working class than just what was in those 10 points. But for instance, they included abolishing inheritance and public education. So he was, as other really important Marxists after him, like we talked about Debs earlier in the day, you know, he understood the long vision and then what to fight for right now, what's really going to make a difference and pull people toward understanding socialism as the solution.
So I'm not looking for a fight, but I do want to make sure that people understand that there are some very different points of view being represented on the panel. And I just want to say, for example, that I'm not a Leninist. I'm certainly not a Maoist. I'm not even going to talk about Stalin in the same breath. Right? But I'm not a Trotskyist. I think Lenin went wrong not in 1921, but rather in 1918. All right, and the prospects for the revolution to succeed were dead by 1918. No, there were still oppositional voices, you know, in Russia, and maybe it could have been reversed. I'm skeptical of that. But I just want to make clear that you arrive at very different political understandings in today's world if you have a different understanding of what you think happened 100 plus years ago. I don't want to argue about it, but I just want to make it clear that we can't all just keep pretending that those differences don't exist. About the matter of Marxism as a science, C.L.R. James once wrote, I think in Modern Politics, that Marxism provided a theoretical basis for scientific humanism. What I think James meant by scientific at that point was universal humanism. That humanism was not just for the Europeans or for the Anglo-Saxons, okay? Humanism was for humanity. And that there was, in fact, a way of understanding the world's history and its development, okay, that allowed us to understand and kind of be convinced of that and to carry it forward. It's a different understanding of science, but I think it's an important one. I'll stop there.
I would just say quickly that there has been a lot of development of capitalism since 1848, and there's been a lot of development of the state, such that Bonapartism, I think, no longer really describes the state in a very helpful or effective way. Whether that is development of Marxism depends on whether an iteration of Marxism arises which is able to cope with and deal with these things. If an iteration of Marxism arises that's able to cope with and deal with these things, then these things were necessary prerequisites for Marxism to be successful and would be part of its eventual success. But if that's not the case and we have to be wedded to a specific concrete worldview from the 19th century, then yeah, no progress has been made from the point of view of that.
Okay, this is yours.
Let's go with Richard and Kevin.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
So I think that when we talk about Marxism in the 21st century, obviously, and this was brought up already on the panel, there's a disagreement about Marxism in the 20th century and the reasons for its failure or success. So there certainly were attempts, revolutions, to overcome capitalism in the 20th century. And the problem from the standpoint of many people, there are two problems. One is the question that those seem to have resulted in repressive one-party dictatorships. So the question would be, well, what does one think about the regimes that originated? Congress and the FRSO seems to approve of most of those regimes. And the other question is the economic problem, which is fundamental to Marxism, which is that if one overcomes capitalism, what replaces it? And traditionally, what has actually replaced it is some model of a centrally planned economy. And that has also encountered problems. So the question is, what do you think of those two aspects of what used to be called real existing socialism in the 20th century? The one-party state and the centrally planned economy.
Oi. In a sense, those are really classic questions that were asked all throughout the 20th century too, as you know, certainly in the West, but also by lots of Soviet subjects who were like, well, this is not socialism, right? They have great jokes about what they're not eating, which is much, but not much. Those are really important points, I think, for people who want to hold up 20th century Marxism as a path for the present. But I take what Liz was saying to be that if we, as we're reformulating this for the present, there are a lot of experiences in there, not all of them are good, and certainly the outcomes have a lot of serious problems. I see Marx's work as a basis for rethinking overcoming capitalism, approaching capitalism now. The state is clearly captured by capitalist interests, at least in the core economies, and what is aspiring to be captured in peripheral economies. So the state is, in a sense, enthralled to capital, even more now than it was in the 19th century. So it leads to a political outcome if you start with economics and you start with Marx's critique of capital, because it's the only one that gives names to a lot of its satanic processes. It gives those names. Does that mean there is a program formulated there that we can follow? In fact, not. Certainly not in late Marx. In late Marx, there's really no program. He did some good critiques of programs, and he indicates a little bit, but Marx doesn't have to be the Bible for organizing the future, and certainly Lenin or Mao don't have to be that either.
Well, yeah. I guess I'll take both questions sort of as they came. First, the historical achievements of socialism. I know it's blasphemy to say, but yes, I do believe that the achievements of socialism in the Soviet Union, in the People's Republic of China, in Cuba, Vietnam, and in the Eastern Bloc were progressive. I think that people's lives were improved. I think that people's access to education, healthcare, and in fact, the real levers of power in their society were greatly elevated. And I think that this is still the case in China today. I still think that China is a socialist state, as does our organization. Now I'll say, obviously, we're Marxists. We don't take things in moral black and white. If we do, well, we're missing all of the lessons that can be found in that gray. And yeah, of course, there were excesses in any socialist project as they faced the actual hurdles of defending a revolution, of defending the real gains that working people made, gains that I refuse to disavow or call, worthless to defend. And then I'll say also on the question of economy, that has been an ever-evolving aspect of socialist projects. Obviously, war communism and socialism with Chinese characteristics don't have a lot of overlap. And so to ask, what do you think about the economics of these states, I think is both a moving target, but also, as broad as asking, what do you think about Marxism in the 21st century? I don't think that there's a satisfactory answer there other than, in a lot of cases, it led to a massive improvement in the standard of living. And, I think that, if we actually want to go out and win the workers to socialism, we do have to improve their fucking lot in life. I'll say that. I don't know. Maybe I'm a little biased as a worker, but. Wait, here, just so I can hear you. Yeah.
If the FRSO were successful in leading a revolution, would there be a multi-party state or a one-party state? And would you have a centrally planned economy in the United States?
One class, one party. Simple as that. And I'll say also, a planned economy, I think, makes a lot of sense here, given the level of development. But also, I mean, I don't know what the hell the United States is going to look like when we take power. If we take power. God willing. But, you know, we'll see.
When?
When? Look, I'm being realistic here, Andrea. I gotta say, I always, look, I want revolution in my lifetime, preferably revolution in your lifetime. But, you know, we gotta be humble.
Maybe more likely in yours than mine. I think, you know, of course, as a Trotskyist, I have a very distinct perspective on the worker states. I think that the Russian Revolution was an immense achievement for the working class and for humanity in general. I think that because the first revolution towards socialism took place in such a impoverished and backward, and I don't mean that as a slam, but I mean culturally, literacy, technologically, how spread out the country was, the hostility of, you know, the both sides in World War I against the new state. You know, it was up against a lot. And I think that those material and historical conditions gave rise to Stalinism, which I don't think was a good thing. I think that you can't have socialism without democracy. Otherwise, you have something else. And what we Trotskyists call that is a worker state, because it did achieve great things in improving literacy, the standard of living, for a while, women's rights, and other worker states have also made, I mean, Cuba, you know, leapt forward relative to the rest of Latin America after the revolution. But I do believe to have socialism, you have to have democracy. In terms of the economy, and that's what we fight for. In the same way that workers want us to say, we want to improve your lot in life, they also want democratic rights. And that is a big thing right now, because they're being taken away. In terms of the economy, I think that a planned economy is a good thing, but it has to be informed by what people really need and want. And I think it's possible to do that. And I think a centralized economy that is nationalized, that is really the property of the workers, is the one that can solve problems that are national and global in scale.
I'll just say, I don't think nation states can do socialism. I think the nation state is out of gas as a political form. I think we need a new politics. I've written elsewhere about the possibility of a supranational federal republic, the purpose of which would be to empower localities, cities, and counties to make decisions about what they would like to do with the surplus. Because I have no time for nation states, I also have no time for national liberation as a concept. I think that's regressive. And I think anti-imperialism, insofar as it's fixated on national liberation, is also regressive. And I'll say all of that just so that everybody knows where I stand.
It's good not to be shy.
Kevin. Yep. Two questions. The first is for Ben, John, and Paul, because they're not speaking as part of organizations, so they don't get this question as often. So the first question for them is, what concrete political events from the history of pre-1917 Marxism do you guys dislike the most, and why? And pre-1917, because Stalinism is too easy of an answer. The second question is now for everyone. So Marxism and the workers' movement for socialism has been definitively dead as a mass political movement for a long time, a century if not longer, and I mean like really dead. So given that, what's the next best thing we as humanity can get in 2026? And I'd like it if you're, like, the more imaginative and utopian your guys' answers, the better. Like, please don't be conservative in your imagination. God's watching up on high. He'll know if your answer is, or your imagination is conservative. So just to recap the two questions for Ben, John, and Paul, what do you dislike the most about pre-1917 Marxism, a concrete political event, and why? And then for everyone, what's the next best thing after Marxism died?
Thank you. Oh, thank you. Well, I'll be very brief. I feel a little like Hans Mollman up here. I still like Stalin, and I don't think that the left or the workers' movement is dead. I think if we treat it like it is, it may as well be, But we have the subjective ability to go out and organize. Our conditions are not our own. We don't choose them. But I see a lot of potential. I'll say that.
Is that enough? 1848? I don't know, there isn't much Marxist politics before 1917, real Marxist politics before 1917. What did they, politics meaning actual actions? 1848, because it was naive and they hadn't understood capitalism enough to know what the forces they were fighting against were going to do, so it kind of fizzled. I like that the least. John?
I'm trying hard not to evade your question. I can think of lots of things before 1917 that are actually I find inspiring. I don't know that how many of them were Marxist. I mean, I think, for example, the Commune, from what I understand, the members of the First International in Paris, the Parisian branch of it, played a very, very active, important role, not alone, with the anarchists in establishing and then pushing forward the Commune to remain one of the most extraordinary examples of human freedom and the possibility of human emancipation. I think that the victory over the South in the Civil War and the establishment of the Reconstruction governments was another extraordinary step. And I think that what Paul said is that certainly kind of even with the establishment of the combined German Social Democratic Party in 1875, I guess, I don't know that there was a Marxist movement. Probably the establishment of the Second International in 1889, I believe, represented in some ways an embrace of a certain kind of Marxist politics, but from the very beginning, I mean, it was divided into left and right wings, and you had Kautsky on the one hand, and you had Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht on the other, and others important ones. So I think that perhaps when can we appropriately date the kind of development of Marxism as distinct from Marx's own work and political contributions? I wouldn't describe them as Marxism, so that brings us to 1883. And I don't know if that there's anything especially horrible. I mean, 1917 made up for it in spades, and then the assassination of Rosa Luxemburg and the defeat of the German Revolution in 1919 certainly was a kind of horrendous event, and it was made possible to some extent by some of the Marxists inside the Social Democratic Party in Germany. But I'm not sure, I didn't mean to evade your question at all. But I would turn to, how to imagine the possibility. One is, I think we have to be prepared for the unexpected. I think even this past year has provided us with a good number of examples of unexpected developments. the organization on the ground of the anti-ICE, defense networks and resistance networks is something that no one imagined possible a year ago. And, that one of the things that I often turn to when thinking about the possibilities of the future is the emergence of the modern civil rights movement in 1954-55. No one saw that coming. No one saw the the Jim Crow system was about to be exploded, and that it would subsequently lay the groundwork for what became the student movement, the anti-war movement, the gay liberation movement, the women's liberation movement. No one saw any of that in 1952, 53. That was in the clutches of the Red Scare and of American conservatism. So I would urge you actually be surprised, but do what you can in the meantime to make the surprise happen.
Okay, the mistake, the worst thing that happened before 1917, 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, produced tons of confusion about what politics is among Marxists and people on the left, produced a situation where you tend to have people who commit to the nation state and national liberation on one side, and anarchists who refuse to think politically on the other side. Still leads to mystification and confusion. I mean, you saw the panel earlier, the term Bonapartism just locks people up and makes it really hard for them to have a productive conversation. It's really not a very helpful concept. In terms of if we didn't have Marxism, what would I do? I would use Platonism to critique liberal realism. So I would put Plato and Hobbes into a dialectic, and I would use this to replace Marxism with an alternative synthesis.
How's that utopian then?
How's that utopian? Plato, man, come on. The Republic, the good. You have a dialectical object that you can be tearing with. It's right there. How do you think we got here? We got here with that stuff. How did Hegel get here? He read that.
Well, since I only have to answer one of the questions, I don't think Marxism is dead, so I don't have to imagine an alternative or a successor. I mean, that was a big part of my talk, obviously, and I kind of joked about reasons why you can see that Marxism isn't dead, because, people are always accusing opponents of the capitalist order of, Marxism and communism, and it's somebody in another panel talked about how it's still haunting. The specter that was haunting Europe is still haunting political discourse today. So I made a couple of jokes, but seriously, millions of people all over the world in struggle are still inspired by Marxism. People in Latin America that we're in touch with, people in Asia, people all over the world. And it's just simply not dead.
Let's go Rosa, then Hilario.
Hi. I'm still trying to think about how you guys are answering the prompt of this panel, because it's not clear to me if I'm getting the answer. Because it's clear to, okay, maybe North, you said Marxism matters because, he has some categories that were useful to understand capitalism, and we're still living in capitalism, so we should still think about those categories, right? So in that sense, okay, you respond to the question, although I do wonder how is it that just applying the categories that were valid at one time and this time, like how do we make that leap of making the fact that we can just use those categories? I can see how, maybe it mattered in the point where the reality was that one, but okay, just on that sense, and just more for everyone, I just don't understand what is distinctive about Marxism. Why do we need Marxism at all? Because, okay, to say that capitalism is bad or that US imperialism is a problem, or that there's a problem in Iran or Palestine. I mean, the right does that all the time. I mean, the Nazis wanted a world revolution, right? I mean, why Marx? Is it just one response to the fact that we're living in these bad conditions? Because there's a lot of responses to it in all sorts of ways. So I still don't understand why Marxism matters, because it's just, it seems like it's just another response. So could you guys explain this a little bit more?
Are you asking the question, I think there are many, many Marxisms. There have been many, many Marxisms, and most of them we should be grateful beyond belief, okay, that they're dead, all right? And a few remaining ones, we should try to do what we can to kill them, all right? There are a small number of Marxist traditions, to use the phrase that's been described, that are worth discovering, recovering, remembering, and developing. Okay, that would include the Marxism of the Council Communists. It would include the Marxism of the Johnson Forest tendency. It would include the Marxism of the Situationists. Maybe it would include the Marxism of the Surrealists. There are any number of possibilities of Marxisms that need to be further understood, developed, and elaborated. I think even if that happened, though, I don't think we need to look for a unitary Marxism that serves all purposes to the exclusion of all other approaches. I have said in the earlier thing, I think that anarchism is a very, very important current that should not be disparaged, and so did Marx, okay? And a really fine essay by Maximilian Rubel titled Marx, the Architect of Anarchism, okay? He sees Marx as being one of the people who provided a sound theoretical basis for the need for anarchism to emerge. And I think that, that we have to be open to the possibility there certainly are going to be other revolutionary currents that need to be brought to the fore and need to be appreciated. The human history is human history. Marxism was a product of a small little corner of Europe at a certain point in time. It had some universalist aspirations, many of which were admirable and to some extent successful, but I don't want to keep on going on. It's not an all or nothing proposition that Marxism matters. It could matter, it should matter, but it doesn't matter to the exclusion of other important trends in human thought and action.
Is it okay if I jump in, or are you ready?
Go for it.
Oh, okay. So other traditions of human thinking are very generative, but don't have the object of Marxism in front of mind. So the object of overcoming capitalism from within the limits. Platonism is something which doesn't require capitalism to be relevant, existed before capitalism, will exist after capitalism. Hobbesian realism, liberal realism is concerned with the maintenance of order, and so tends to be kind of anti-change and kind of static a lot of the time. It inspires a certain take responsibility for the chaos and devastation of the things that you do. Bear in mind that peace is necessary to be able to do other kinds of things, and that peace is a fragile thing. It's hard to preserve. Order is hard to maintain. The other traditions that I am interested in tend to be less focused on that overcoming the limits element. And that's the area where I think the focus on freedom has something that it contributes. It has a priority on getting outside of limits, and with speed, with intensity, that other traditions tend not to have, in part because other traditions are more content to be practiced by an elite, don't feel the need to necessarily emancipate the workers because they can naturalize the workers, potentially, as not really having the ability to think anyway. Now you can work through these traditions in such a way that they say stuff that points beyond, and you could, over time, reconstruct a way of pointing forward from within those points of view. But to have Marxism in dialogue with those things puts urgency on the overcoming of the limits in a way that those traditions by themselves would not.
Yeah, I really agree with that. And just to be really concrete, to answer your question, imagine the wage form. Marx and Engels really thought that the other kinds of politics that they had both practiced and thought were emancipatory, like liberalism, which of course in Germany, which was very backwards in all sorts of ways, not good ways for the people living there. There was Up until Napoleon came through, there were 300 individual principalities with their own rules, so you couldn't actually, if you wanted to sell a horse, you couldn't do it in all the different states in the same way. You were likely to just fall into sickness on your way to sell the horse across Germany. It was a total disarray. So liberal reforms would have been great, and for them, the nation state seemed like a great leap forward. But they started to realize that there was some problem in spreading Napoleonic reforms, and spreading democratic decision-making, and spreading the ability of the people to decide on their own existence to the people themselves, and that was what they discovered capitalism was. One name for that is the wage form. The wage form looks like you're getting paid for the amount of time that you work, but in fact it's a lie. And you can't understand that it's a lie until you read the whole of Capital, unfortunately. That also was an obstacle, by the way, to the transformation of the system, having to read Capital. So that's just to say, there's a lot of insights in Marxism, in Marx, and in a lot of Marxisms that will help us understand the obstacles to attaining a better political organization. But je ne suis pas Marxiste, I'm also not a Marxist. And I think there are traditions to be drawn from, and there isn't anything stronger than Marx's late writing for understanding the situation that we're in right now. It's a complete extension of the mid to late 19th century.
I think that the short answer to the question is why Marxism still matters is because we still have capitalism, and we still need to get rid of it. And Marxism is the best, and to change something, you have to understand it. There's a social science involved, and I think that Marxism still does the best job of explaining what we're up against and who is best suited to make the change, that is the working class. I think that, ideas live on, and Marxism has lived on. And I think that with the idea, the Hegelian and Marxist idea that things are born and endure out of necessity, I think that's true of Marxism. It was needed, and it's still needed.
Yeah, so on this question, I mean, some of what I would say has already been said. The working class is the principal revolutionary subject, obviously. A historical understanding of how capitalism has developed as an objective process, not just an idea in people's heads. The fusing of materialism and an elevated form of dialectics, and I do just want to address, when we talk about imperialism, often people are, vulgarizing that term. What we really are talking about is monopoly capitalism, the new, improved, latest, highest form of capitalism. And so, if we want to overcome it, if we want to push past this place that we are in, well, right now we're in the muck. And so, how are we going to get out of it? We have to start looking around, understand the conditions we have, understand this world we find ourselves in. Marxism gives us the tools to do that, and Marxism identifies our road out in the broadest terms.
I call Laurie next.
Could I?
Oh, you can respond.
Yeah. Sorry, there's one thing I wanted to say that I forgot briefly. I don't think that people have to read all of Capital to understand Marxist economics. There are some very good summaries, and there's one called, a really old one that's very good, An American Looks at Karl Marx by William Blake, not the poet. And David Harvey in contemporary writing is very good. He's got writings, he's got YouTubes, and And I don't think that every single person who wants to make the revolution has to understand capital, but somebody does.
Could I add one thing? As some of you heard me say before, I was very much influenced by the organization close to Journey of Truth organization that was a local Chicago product in 1969, lasted until about 1984. But in 1978, they kind of for the first time began conducting classes, classes in dialectics, and what it was titled was Learning How to Think. And basically what it wanted to do is, unlike most of the political organizations of the time, variously Trotskyist, Stalinist, Maoist, whatever, is they didn't want to teach people how to memorize the line and how to follow the line and how to defend the line. They wanted people to learn how to think. Marxism is a way of thinking, and it would be good for all of us to do more of it.
Get all the microphones. Accumulating. It's like capitalism over here.
Yeah, thank you for the panel. My question goes into a similar direction as the previous question, so I'd like to shorten it a bit. The panel question is, how does Marxism matter in the 21st century? And one could say that despite, all of you having, articulated different positions, in a certain sense one could say that all of you said it matters in exactly the same way as it mattered in the 20th century. So, and in that sense, I would, and maybe just a quick, if you might forgive me that quick comparison, but it sort of gave me the vibe of people trying to get back with their ex, in a sense, that not acknowledging that, a certain relationship ended, and you might, you can enter a new relationship that's, I don't want to disencourage anyone. I sympathize with the impulse, but there seems to be just a very grave underestimation of, the moment we are in. And so I'd like to just ask two questions following up on that thought. Why do you think all of the things that you have said, that many people have tried before, reading Capital, Mao, Trotsky, doing the anarchist thing, and also performances like the one Studebaker gave. Why did it not work in the latter half of the 20th century? And is there anything genuinely new in the 21st century, our current condition, that one has to authentically respond to in a way that hasn't been modeled by anyone before? Thank you.
In a sense, we and you are talking in big generalities. The present moment, the past, the 20th century, they're really huge. But I think you can identify a lot of things that have, in the 20th century and the 19th century, that have just become entrenched and deepened. If we're talking about this particular form of economic life and reason that we're calling capitalism, many things are still the same. You don't see industrial capitalism around here in the same way, but 2 billion people work in it in other parts of the world. So to be fair, the present moment is a couple hundred years long. But there are some really interesting changes that have turned everything over and that Marx won't help us with too much. One is the domination, again, in economic terms, of finance. And there's some people who are writing about it. There is no comprehensive version of it that ties it to the whole in the way that Capital tries to tie industrial capital to the whole. But you can read Melinda Cooper. I can give you a reading list. And they're trying to understand this because Capital has turned a lot of this on its head again. So it turns out that Western society has two heads, and now it's on the other head.
Okay, so on the question of specific features, particular features of the 21st century that sort of cry out for Marxism, I see two sort of clear, repeated examples. First, I don't know how many of you remember Occupy. I know the millennials in the room might feel old hearing that, but I know I was like 6, so fair. But millions of people came into the streets, and then millions of people went home. In the Arab Spring, millions of people came out into the streets, and all that seems to have resulted is a new American puppet in Syria and a decade of fracture, instability, and dashed dreams for revolution. I think we can see again and again these mass, spontaneous movements without the subjective addition of a party, of something that can actually take the reins and push things in a further direction. You know, not magically create new conditions, but can at the very least take advantage of those that exist. And I think that a great deal of the failure of the 21st century has been, well, I'll say, Hilario, you're not the first to call for a breakup. Revisionism has a very long and proud history. People who want to whittle away at the revolutionary core of Marxism, you know, are not a new force. And in 1991, those revisionists, after a long quantitative move, made a qualitative move. And capitalism was restored in the Soviet Union. The worker state was overthrown. A huge dive in life expectancy took place across Eastern Europe. And, frankly, socialism was replaced with an even worse form of capitalism.
But was Lenin a revisionist when he thought anew about his situation, which was different than Marx's? I mean, I wasn't arguing for, that was not the point.
When I say revisionism, I don't mean updating. I mean whittling away at the revolutionary core of Marxism, which is what I said. And what I mean when I say that is that the revolutionary core of Marxism, in my view, has been laid out as I've said it. It is the understanding that monopoly capitalism and imperialism are one and the same. It is the understanding that the working class is the force that is going to be able to bring down capitalism. And it's the understanding this is all an objective historical process. And that, we're on the path to it. Sorry to interrupt, but.
Yeah, I'd like to go.
Of course.
You've got all the microphones.
That's true, I do have all the microphones. It's almost like they're accumulating. So in answer to this question, so in my new book, one of the things I do is argue that 20th century theories of legitimacy are no longer plausible and have run out of steam. 20th century theories of legitimacy like Kosselak's or Habermas's rely on the idea that there's a society which has a morality and a state, and that these things can become estranged or separated from each other, and then there's a confrontation between the two or some productive dialectic between the two. And this has led to all of the leftists since Habermas arguing in terms of this dialectic of democracy. You criticize the democracy, the national democracy, for not being democratic enough, and then it's supposed to have to make concessions to you. This obviously doesn't work now. It's obvious that that doesn't work. People are still making the argument, but it's increasingly ridiculous to make the claim that we can go through national democracy through a dialectic in relation to that abstraction. It's increasingly manifestly ridiculous. This opens an opportunity to rethink the politics, which might allow Marxism to become something different, something with a politics that might actually have some traction. So there's some opportunity there. Now, obstacles. I think we've moved into a period I call middle capitalism. Middle capitalism is a horrible, long, vast, miserable period where you've got like 40% of the population that goes through the university system, and you've got some countries in the world that have become very consumption-oriented, and then you've got 60% of the population in the United States that doesn't go through the university system, an even larger percentage in developing countries, and many developing countries that are production-oriented and have become obsessed with export-driven growth. These cleavages in terms of the economic model in different parts of the world and in terms of the socialization of different parts of the population produce antagonisms, not just at the level of stupid culture war social issues, but also at the level of epistemology. People don't agree on what counts as knowledge. Do you trust the technocrats and the scientists and the experts because they went to college, or do you want democratic common sense? And then also people don't agree on aesthetics. What's cringe and what's based? What's cool and what's not cool? No one agrees anymore. No one will ever agree again. What are you supposed to do when you go on a date? You don't know, and you're not gonna know. Postmodernists misrecognized this and essentialized it and treated it as a transhistorical category and wasted the back half of the 20th century in that garbage. We now have a chance to get outside of it, and all you have to do is take up the good.
I thought you were going to say read your book.
I think we can just move on to the next question. Ingar.
Yeah, I'm speaking from an ecumenical Marxist perspective. Obviously it's easy to observe the loss of innocence of the socialist movement when Marxism was put into practice. I mean, I think there seems to be an agreement that Marx left a good analysis of capitalism as an ideal, average ideal, that the work is incomplete, that people have tried to complete it on various levels, but that it's the contestation is the politics. And obviously there's limits to, or it's easy to point out limits of anti-imperialism when, for instance, it throws the working classes of countries that are part of the other camp under the bus, right? Like workers in Iran, for instance, right? But at the same time, when it comes to, I think Mao Zedong did have a point when he said that a theory is successful when the politics that's connected to the theory is successful. And maybe we should get off our high horse in the West, given that we weren't successful with our socialist policies or politics here. And I think we wouldn't be here talking about those issues if it hadn't at least been to the October Revolution. Because Marxism was already dead in August 1914, right? Like, the working class had been nationalized, so proletarian internationalism was dead. And if it hadn't been for the October Revolution that inspired, brought revolution back onto the agenda in the West, Marx would have been considered a theorist of the 19th century, like Gareth Stedman Jones, right? Like, it had, for a certain period of time, had an influence over the German labor movement, where Kautsky wrote a Marxist program in 1891, and had some influence on Russian intellectuals in the 1890s. But it was the October Revolution that inspired revolution in the West and also inspired the Chinese. I mean, it's unfathomable that under the conditions in China, a communist party would have formed and adopted Marxism. I mean, it was a semi-colonial, semi-feudal, and not even semi-capitalist country. And from there, because the revolution was successful, it traveled to Cuba. And Cuba, you had a whole cycle of guerrilla strategies of communism, leading up to the Bolivarian Revolution when that subsided. So what I'm trying to say is, of course, there's all been victims in this history. There's been failures, there's been loss of innocence, but it's the reason that we're still here that we remember Marx, that he was an important thinker. And I think that's something that we should think about with some form of humility.
I mean, nobody ever made Platonopolis, but we remember Plato. You know, I think that the fetishizing of what people have been able to do historically has done enormous damage to human imagination. Because when people have to look at the past and look at what others have actually brought into being, then they internalize the limits which those previous projects incorporate and forget about them and reify and naturalize them. And the nation state is an incredibly limited structure that cannot deliver us from capitalism, couldn't deliver the Soviet Union, couldn't deliver Cuba, can't deliver Iran, can't deliver China. None of these states will get out of capitalism through the nation state. And if we are so depressed that we have to heap praise on projects that have no future, none, and I include the American nation state, the European nation states, the Euro-Gaullism that's going on today. It has no future, none. in terms of emancipating people, in terms of helping them to live good lives, in terms of helping them to escape from wage labor. And when we do this because we want to keep going and we don't have anything that we really believe in, so we start grabbing things from nature, grabbing anthropological stories, grabbing little history stories, and trying to comfort ourselves in these theories of causes. They're rooted in fixed, rigid schemes about history and nature and anthropology. It greatly limits us. For that reason, I think it's important to be more abstract. And I think that theory really matters, because without theory, man, you're just going to keep reproducing the same stupid shit.
I don't know, I thought I was going to respond, and then I thought I wasn't going to respond, and now I feel like I just don't think theory is so separate from events and even the theorist's experience, Plato being one who had a number of political experiences, lived through tyranny and democracy, and tried to advise a king, at least in legend. That didn't work out very well. I'm not sure. I think theory is a good repository for helping us train to make some change, but so is reading history.
Well, I'll say that myself, I'm definitely not prepared to surrender the historical achievements of the working class and of socialism. I'm not prepared to say that this has all been a failure and all sort of throw our hands up in the air and say we have to go back to our imaginations. We don't need only our imaginations. We need to look and say, okay, we've done it before. Our class has done it before. Our class has taken the reins of power before. Let's do it again. And let's do it properly this time, the whole fucking way. Now I think we can. Oh, yeah, good job. Yeah, I like that we have enthusiasm there. But yeah, I was done talking, but thank you for clapping.
I think that, part of what I have thought about this whole weekend, because a lot of what Platypus is dedicated to is inquiry, investigation, critique. And I think one of the really valuable things about Marx is that he provided theory, he provided critique. As somebody noted, Volume 1 of Capital was called a critique of political economy, but he moved past that. And he used that, and he synthesized the theory with experience and his own activism, his own agitation, his own organizing. And I think at a certain point, it's very important to, take a stand, take a position, move beyond critique, incorporate that critique into your activism. That's it.
Is this on? Hello? Could I make a suggestion about how we might use, do we have a half hour left or an hour? I'm not sure. Excuse me?
45 minutes.
Okay. Rather than continuing the pattern of asking questions of us, because I have a feeling that we're starting to run stale in terms of our responses, that instead to invite members of the audience, not so much to ask a question of us, but simply to articulate their own points of view about the matters we've been discussing. That might be a better use of the next bit of time that we have, if that's okay.
I think I would like questions. Sorry.
They want to exhaust us. That's part of the goal.
They're certainly succeeding with me.
John, my own point of view is a bit of a question. I put it any other way. I can't put it as a positive statement.
It's okay, it's okay.
But, I want to ask you something that you already know about because we've raised it before in New York, which is about the revolutionary subject. The basis for the discussion of the relevance of Marxism right now is whether we live in capitalism. And it seems like, if we live in capitalism, then Marxism must be the relevant solution. The basis for provoking Marx's critique of capitalism was the organization of the workers in the 1840s, mainly through the Chartist movement. It provided a subject sui generis for which to critique capitalism. There is no organized working class today like there was for Chartism. You all might want that subject, but it exists only as individual workers, not as a class in and for itself. Under that condition, is capitalism just objective conditions? Doesn't it require a subject to grasp it and transform it beyond itself? That is the dialectic. Some of you have taught this, or learning how to think. Without the social consciousness of capital, that is the proletariat, is there really capitalism? And thus, is there Marxism? Why not post-industrial society? Why not bureaucratic collectivism or the managerial society or techno-neo-feudalism?
That's a good question. I guess I don't think that the work. I said earlier in the earlier panel that I subscribe to the idea that the proletariat is not a fixed category. It's not a label that we apply to people who do certain kinds of work, or even those people who produce surplus value, or any of the fine distinctions between unproductive and productive workers and all that stuff, okay? I think the proletariat becomes the social body that wants to no longer reproduce its existence in this social world. They want to abolish itself. They want to abolish not the human beings, but the categories, the social reality they are ensconced in. And who becomes part of that proletariat is, to me, somewhat up in the air. And as I've said and written, okay, the emergence of the modern civil rights movement was not especially led by the workers of the South. It was not led certainly by any of the then existing vanguard parties or any of the left formations. It was a spontaneous revolt that had deep roots in the history of the black folks of the South and other parts of the country, but no one saw it coming. And I think that the wisdom of those people who were paying attention was to understand that it was creating the possibility of a new future that deserved to be nourished and supported and developed, and led to all the things I mentioned earlier about a student movement, a new left movement, a women's movement, a gay liberation movement, and so forth. It didn't solve every problem, of course, and it didn't ultimately succeed even in its own terms. It changed the world and inspired people in the rest of the world as well. I have some reasonable hope, I'm not sure how to answer the question of in my lifetime or not, that another time will come. And I think that we've seen glimmers of that over the course of the last year in terms of the emergence of the anti-ICE movement, okay, which have characteristics that no one could have imagined, no one could have anticipated. How, kind of, for example, a friend of mine in Minneapolis said there were 300 separate resistance networks in the city of Minneapolis when ICE was on the rampage, okay? Most people who had never been involved in political activity of any kind before, probably. Where did that come from? What prompted it? And I assure you that a year ago, as far as I can recall, no one saw that coming. And I think that that's my hope for the future. I think that one thing in the meantime we could do is not do as little damage to that possibility as possible. And I think, unfortunately, that much of what passes as Marxism or socialism or socialist politics or Marxist politics creates more obstacles than it does not. And I think that we would be well served if we were done with them. I hope that's not too harsh.
I just want to say one sort of small point here. I just disagree fundamentally that no one predicted this great freedom movement in the South. And I think,
I'm sorry, FRSO did. I forgot.
No, Harry Hayward and the black Bolsheviks of the Communist Party. Thank you. Or you could.
Remarkable.
Wonderful. Okay. I'm saying fundamentally, we can find the next place that a mass upsurge is coming. We don't have to imagine that one is going to spring from a totally novel source. That's all I'm saying. You know, it wasn't a shock to Harry Hayward.
There are always organizers. And in the South, before the civil rights movement as we know it, there was a great deal of Communist Party organizing, and one of the books that talks about it is called Hammer and Hoe, if people want to read about it. It's the same way with Rosa Parks sitting down on the bus. The myth is that one day she was just tired and she was fed up and she just sat down. There were months, even years of organizing before that. When would be the right time, and so on and so forth. I think that someone said on the panel, and I hope I don't get it too wrong, that until there's working class consciousness, there's no possibility of a party, a working class party. I think it's one of those dialectical things. You could equally say that a party is what can generate working class consciousness. And I think that's the job of Marxists and leftists. But there are always organizers.
Just a quick response to the questioner in the red sweater who's looking at his phone. Okay. No, sorry. Okay, maybe no. Of course. You can imagine that there's whole other ways to understand sociality. Usually you're talking, those things that you mentioned, managerial class and neo-feudalism, really are at home in the central economies, not in peripheral economies in the same way. But in any case, you can imagine that there's something fundamentally different and we need a new theory. That might be the case. But none of the proponents, let's say, of neo-feudalism have been able to explain why it's such a small percentage of the world economy and how it relates to the rest of it. That is to say, to industrial production, to service work. And it may not be the best critical position, but Marx himself, his writing, is the only one that makes the clear connection between those things and the rest of the economy, so you can understand how it all works together in concert. So that's why I don't think you can throw it out. But you really have to take account of these new phenomena and judge whether they're, let's say, fundamental or trivial.
Spencer.
Yeah, it seems to me that in some ways Ben's presentation hasn't really been taken up. And I also want to repose the question that Kevin raised. I think it's a little misleading to say that Marxism is dead the way that Kevin did. It seems to me much clearer that socialism is dead in the core of capitalism. In light of history, where we know that it wasn't just a few people, it wasn't a fringe thing. Every serious intellectual on earth in 1900 and 1910 knew that there was a world movement for socialism, that there was a world party for socialism, that it was a rising force, that it was gaining increasing adherence. Some of that was connected to Marxism, some of that wasn't. That, I think, I don't think you can point to China and say that there are, that socialism and the march to socialism is gripping the people, right? It's a state ideology that most people feel is being shoved down their throats. And it's become an ideology of the status quo to a large degree. And so I think that we should repose the question of Marxism as an intellectual trend within socialism that was perhaps the leading trend within socialism over 100 years ago, versus an intellectual environment today where most intellectuals don't think that socialism is in any sense happening, or to the extent that they do, they think it's the left wing of the Democratic Party. They think it's a form of capitalism and capitalist politics. And of course, one of the great obstacles to socialism, I think, and what do people, especially in the developed world, think the left is, they think it's all the legacies of the 60s, right? They think it's gay liberation and women's liberation and anti-racism and anti-colonialism and, you know, even though it's not said, a kind of youthism. It's the legacy of the new social movements without any sense that the project of the new left was to create a new socialism, that that's what they meant. They didn't mean that we're just going to overcome racism or we're going to liberate women or anything else, but all of those things were also, you know, even as they were in some sense goals in and of themselves, they were also means to the end of reconstituting a socialism that lay in the ditch in the middle of the 20th century, and that failed. And that's why I think Kevin's question needs to be taken a little bit more seriously, right? In terms of what happens to a form of thought, Marxism. Maybe I wouldn't agree with exactly the way that Ben put it, but it does become desiccated in a context of over a century of, you know, either being an ideology that justifies the status quo or being simply divorced from any social movement. And I also want to pose the question to Ben. So what, I guess I want to say, what about what Ben is calling a tradition that's really becoming extremely limited and desiccated? I don't think you can point to recent generations and say that Marxism has been at all creative, right? I just don't think you can. The last creative, you know, Marxists in any sense were of the 1960s and 70s, right? And that was because it was part of a wider project of recovery, of an attempt to return to Marx that was far, far deeper in the 60s and 70s than it has been in the 2000s, zeros, or tens. And the people who call themselves Marxists today are people who just rehearse the arguments of the 60s and 70s, in fact. To Ben, I would ask the question, you say it's a tradition and it has the limits of a traditional form of thinking, but is it really, is there really any other form of intellectual inquiry or preoccupation that has the same kind of limits and the same kind of repetitions and the same kind of untranscendability that other forms of thought have? It seems to me that other traditions of thought can very freely dispense with their own tradition. They can dispense with the past, they can reinvent themselves, they can simply change the subject, there can be new trends. Marxism keeps coming back, right? Maybe as a limitation, maybe as a problem, right? Maybe as something that is uncreative, as I'm suggesting. Nevertheless, I'm not sure that you had this kind of generic notion that it's a tradition and it has the problems of these traditional forms of thinking, but is there really anything else in the same category as Marxism that has this kind of problem, right, where we're kind of stuck with it, stuck in it, in the same way?
First. You know, I wonder if this is a response, not an answer. That I would suggest seriously that one of the reasons why Marxism became fossilized, desiccated, whatever kind of verb you want to apply or adjective, is because of 1917. That basically it became the state religion, supposedly, of that regime. You know, and it lives still with all of the accumulated horrors of that regime and its successor regimes, its copycat regimes. You know, one of the most important political moments in my life was in 1968, I'm not sure exactly, when the Vietnam War was raging, and I would go home to visit my parents in Brooklyn from the Bronx, and my parents could sense, or my father at least, that I was embracing a kind of soft Stalinism, what I refer to, and that I was kind of saying things like about the fact that the Soviet Union had 5-year plans and therefore it didn't suffer the same Great Depression as everyone else did. And all sorts of, some of the things have been said today about that people have, you know, good food and whatever, okay? And he said to me, we had a number of arguments in those days, okay? So he said, Johnny, as I was called then, how come, if that's true, why does no one here want to go there and everyone there wants to come here? It's a good question. And I think we live with that's a profound legacy we live with, the haunting of socialism by the legacy of what was called as the first Marxist revolution.
Would we want to combine that with what Ingar said, which is wouldn't we want to combine that with what Ingar said, that we wouldn't remember Marx at all if it weren't for 1917? That 1917 is the problem, and we wouldn't be remembering Marx and Marxism if it weren't for that.
We did have Rosa Luxemburg as an alternative poem, all right? We could have remembered that as a different starting point. And I'm almost certain we would be much better off. Not sure it's an answer, but it's a response.
So, other traditions that have this dynamic of being in dialogue with an abstraction, seeking to overcome limits in the service of it. Hobbes with peace. Peace is less ambitious. Peace is easier to get. But the idea that you have to overcome security competition and the condition of war to unlock commodious living is there in Hobbes. And the continuous process of needing to find ways to maintain order and to have the peace has a certain dialectical character to it, which produces a certain level of development. More ambitiously, Plato, not just in the ascent out of the cave, but in the descent. So not just the divinization of the soul, but the divinization of politics, coming back down from outside into the cave and seeking to realize what was seen outside with those who are in the cave. And of course, the limits one encounters in trying to do this, a continuous tarrying with the limits of what's possible there. Now, I think that capitalism as a concept invites an enormous level of additional ambition to these kinds of projects in terms of the scope of who can potentially be part of the project and in terms of the speed with which things can be done. The concept of capitalism greatly increases what we're able to talk about there. But I think sometimes when the focus is just on freedom, when it's just about overcoming limits, things can get a little bit confused, and people can think that the point of socialism is to allow themselves to buy a bunch of stuff, or allow themselves to have a good time, or something like that. And certainly, these are part of life. We have to take care of the body. We have to take care of our reputations and make sure that people like us well enough and we feel sufficiently recognized, that we don't carry psychological issues with us. These are things that are important. But when the focus is just on the overcoming of limit and not on something that it's in service of, I think that this tends to lead things to close up. And so for that reason, I like to, there was a talk about dating. Are you trying to get back with your ex? Coming back to Marxism like coming back to your ex. I'm not typically a polyamory guy. But in this context, why not?
Okay, I love that. I think, there was a, you're proposing a spin on Kevin's question, which is maybe not why is Marxism dead, but why is socialism in so much trouble, so desiccated. And I think that, I agree with the problem. I agree with that we have a big problem. I think, again, you look at historical circumstances. That was another thing that Marx, gave us. McCarthyism has been mentioned, and what it did to the radical and labor movements. But I also think there's a very, very material thing, which is the boom after the Second World War, which really allowed a fragment, a segment of the population to enjoy the benefits of US imperialism. And to think that, and in a less negative way, to think that, better days were coming. Things were just going to get better and better. The next generation was going to have it good. Of course, that's only a certain segment of the population. Other people were struggling and oppressed. But I think that boom contributed to the rise of the labor aristocracy, which Lenin talked about as a huge problem in getting to socialism. The labor bureaucracy tied to the Democratic Party. So I think there were these reasons, and I think that on the left, we made a lot of mistakes. I mean, there's no question. I think that sectarianism is has been a big problem. I think opportunism, accommodating to the social democracy and the Democrats and the reformists. But there are reasons, and I don't think that they invalidate socialism. I mean, socialism is both a set of ideas and a movement. And I don't think that the problems, okay, so that's one thing. I was talking about the United States, but over the world, as people have said, people were fighting for socialism and making revolutions that they at least hoped would bring socialism. So I think there's reasons for the conditions that we're in, but I think we better get out of them.
Well, first I'll say, I think some of the frustration, and I think John saw this earlier as well, that some are having, is that we are not surrendering to the prompt. We are engaging with it. We do not believe that the left is dead. We don't believe Marxism is dead, and so of course we're going to answer it in an unsatisfactory way. I hope you all can forgive us for our convictions. But moving past that, obviously, if we are going to go out and try to replicate 1917, little fisherman cap on, all that, we're not really going to produce something of great value because we saw the end of 1917 in 1991. And counter-revolution in 1991, the destruction of the Eastern Bloc, the absolute decimation of the Soviet Union, if you want to see the result of that, it was not a renewed, beautiful socialism like so many of our Trotskyist friends seem to think it would be. It was not new democracies flourishing, masses yearning to be free. If you want to see the result of the destruction of the Soviet Union and the result of the failure of socialism, its dismissal, look at Ukraine, where now two peoples are being fed into a meat grinder by two imperialist powers, and no force seems able to stop it. And I'll say, how do we prevent 1991 again? We take the lessons of it. That class struggle does continue under socialism. That a revolution in the superstructure is a continuous process. That we have to be continuously pushing past each sort of stage that we find ourselves in and try to build a genuine socialist society. Now, obviously, that's not easy to do. China is trying a new path right now. For all the talk of state religions and, what was the phrase, status quos, for all the talk that Platypus does of having a class understanding, you seem to have a lot to say about a classless status quo. I see the status quo of workers' rule, of the Communist Party. And I don't think that that's a status quo I want to give up. The status quo of workers' rule being given up, the result, again, you can see in Ukraine.
Okay, I'm going to take two short questions at once. I'm going to go Blondine, and then I'm going to go Zion.
Thank you. Whoa.
it seems to me that most leftist parties.
Closer. A little closer.
Closer? Okay, good. Okay. I want to ask a question about the existence of Marxism in modern leftist parties in America. It seems to me that most leftist parties in the States have at best become unpaid think tanks for the Democratic Party, and they just either participate in their projects or they criticize them, or they become kind of impotent, existing merely as kind of a child who's playing with an unplugged-in controller. I was wondering, because it appears to me that even if in expression the party may consider itself Marxist, the party is unable to imagine itself in practicality as anything more than a reformist party which uses some far-off Brocken specter, the untouchable shadow of revolution, solely to justify their lack of liquidation into the political mainstream. So how is the modern-day political party able to be Marxist when reality seems to offer them no capacity to express themselves beyond capitalist liberal politics? How can Marxism be more than just reviving Kautsky over and over again?
This question is mostly for Liz, but anyone who wants to can answer it as well. Do you agree with Ben that Marx's critique of capitalism is not primarily about reducing exploitation, both of individuals and nations, but concerned with overcoming wage labor? And if so, how is your ideal form of Marxism in practice, in Liz's case, actually existing in socialism, tangibly help achieve that? And then the second part is, what is Marxism's position to the working class if their discontents with capitalism come down to their exploitation at the hands of capitalists rather than a desire to overcome labor itself as a mode of life?
Okay, yeah, long question. I wish it was written out like one of these prompts. But I'll sort of tackle what comes to mind, I guess. First, revolution happens in the superstructure. It's not going to beautifully, immaculately abolish wage labor as soon as we cross the finish line. And I don't know if y'all have heard the story of the Bolsheviks celebrating when they reached the number of days the Paris Commune had reached. They didn't abolish wage labor then because they couldn't. Because the base of society remains the same in this lower stage of socialism. Yeah, because we are not creating a new set of, or a new means of production when we conquer state power and smash the old state. We are laying the groundwork to do just that.
I guess to put it really simply, how is the state of China, for instance, tangibly moving towards the abolition of labor? I guess I'll repeat that. To put it simply, how is the state of China tangibly making progress towards abolishing labor as a form of life?
Well, I mean, pretty simply, they're trying to raise the actual level of these forces of production. And I know, we've all heard forces of production, who cares about it, whatever. But what I'm saying is, they are, through the use of high technology, automation, renewable energy. I mean, for folks who were in the Bonapartism panel, we heard a little bit about some of what China's doing, successfully with their state, regardless of what we think of it. I think evidently, with 800 million lifted out of poverty, resulting in the, net improvement in living standards that so many capitalist economists seem so happy to celebrate, I think they're doing something qualitatively different than the rest of the world. And I think that the Communist Party allows just that. I think that their state planning, their ability to embed cadre in all levels of economic life, I think they are working on it. But they're not working on it in the conditions that they chose. They're working on it in a situation where their largest trading partner was disintegrated and then turned into a new imperialist power. You know, I think I'm going to cut them a little slack on figuring out this fundamental contradiction, you know, in the less than 100 years they've managed to be in power. I don't even remember what that question was.
Yeah, just to reemphasize the first question, what about, like, why does the left dissolve into the Democratic Party at some levels? And what about council?
Oh, yeah. Wait, should I keep talking, or?
Anybody can answer.
If somebody else wants to go, I don't want my voice to be the only one here.
Well, as I remember the question, it was, how can you continue to be Marxist, given, what was the given? I have the first part of it. How can you continue to be Marxist, given...
when reality seems to offer them no capacity to express themselves beyond capitalist liberal politics?
Well, I think that, for one thing, I think you can use capitalist liberal politics to an extent to move the struggle forward and to spread Marxist ideas. But I also think that on the ground organizing, and including in labor unions, even though they are so tied up with the state, I think that that is, I think you can retain your Marxist principles and argue for socialism. There's no other, you know, I think you can still continue agitating and organizing for the end goal while using the fight for reform, some of which are life and death questions, you know, in the immediate. I think a lot of times that doesn't happen. I mean, you point to something very real, which is that, you know, not only socialists, but other movements that see themselves as progressive or radicals get sucked into the Democratic Party. It ain't easy, but I think it can be done.
All right. Let's go Michael, then Clay.
All right. I want to raise the elephant in the room that's taped to the blackboard at the rear of this lecture theatre, and that is the American Revolution. My question slightly reframes the panel topic because there seems to be an impasse surrounding the word Marxism. Perhaps Marxism appears nebulous today, and I'll concede that point. Instead, I want to ask, how does revolution matter in the 21st century? There are people in this room who were born in the year 2000 or later. How much longer can we continue to appeal to revolution for? In the year 3000, will we still continue to appeal to revolution, and why?
Yeah. Well, I don't think that revolution went out of vintage after the French Republic was crushed, or I guess the French Empire by that point. And I don't think it remains any less relevant so long as there are, or that there is a state, that there is this repressive apparatus removed from the people that we do have to defeat. It is a practical thing, a real existing material thing. Myself, I joined the movement out of 2020 because I saw waves and waves of protest come up against that repressive state and achieved nothing. Without any kind of sort of central pole, that subjective force I've been talking about, that party, it wasn't happening. And so, yeah, this is why I think revolution is important. And the Marxist understanding of revolutionists.
All right, I'll jump in. I don't know about the usefulness of the word revolution or the revolutionary hopes anymore. So I'm with you there, and if it comes to 3,000 and we're still waiting for this, that will have been a terrible event. But I do think that thinking about what the new words will be, how we're going to think about moving from here to maybe what Ben thinks it should be after, or whatever it is, I think it has to make reference to Marx, because nobody else is giving us words for this situation. I've said that a number of times. But if you're looking to us for how to get there, what you see on the panel, which I think is interesting, is that everyone is trying one way or the other. And they're not stuck in a debate about, which is really a kind of deep disappointment with revolutionary politics at the moment. And I'm sympathetic to it too. I guess I was born in 1971, so I'm whatever generation that is. I don't really have any money or property. I can tell you all about me. It's a terrible struggle always, but I thought doing intellectual work was the way I had to spend my life, and so I gave up every other possibility for that. And I'm relatively happy, even if I can't afford a coffee all the time. But I do think we need new words for change, transformation, revolution. We need to find those. There's a lot of text where people are working that out now, and we need to understand the current conjuncture. And the people who are doing that are looking at finance, and they're looking at imperialism. A lot of the same things attain. And so we shouldn't push Marx and Marxism away. We should mind them and reconfigure them for understanding the present.
You know, a long, long time ago, there were these empires in China and Persia and in the Levant that were structured completely on the basis that if you were not very careful, you would be invaded by a bunch of people on horses. And what you did, everything that you did, had to be compatible with keeping the people on the horses out. Nothing you did could transgress against this. It imposed very sharp limits on the ways in which people could imagine living. Security competition limits our forms of cooperation. There's an analogy here. Commercial competition, competition to be profitable, competition to not be impoverished, also greatly limits and restricts our forms of living. In the academy, you have to conduct yourself a certain way if you want a tenure-track job. This fear of not having such a thing greatly limits and restricts what you can do and who you can be. If we were not scared of being killed, and if we were not scared of having to move back with our parents or being out on the street, or whatever horrible fate would await you if you didn't have any money, depending on your own situation, what would we do? There's some version of life that you would live if you were not scared. Some version of life that would be good as you see it, as you conceptualize it. What do we have to make so that life is not dictated by fear, but by what you think would be good for you? That's what we have to get people thinking about. And I agree with Spencer that the millennials, my generation, have not produced this at all. They've not produced an iteration of Marxism that invites people to think seriously about this. But I'm not talking to them, I'm talking to you. And there's an opportunity for us to not do what these other people are doing, what all of the stupid people who are obsessed with the nation state and civilizational thinking and all this other bullshit are doing, which is choosing sides and putting flags in their profile and rooting for some nation state to win the security competition and the commercial competition and impose its form of order, or to have multiple blocks in an endless death struggle to be profitable and to win wars. There's no escape in that. There's no way out. That way is shut.
Well, on the question of will we still be talking about revolution if it hasn't happened by 3000? I think the question is ahistorical and idealist. I mean, revolutions happen all the time. To think that another revolution is not going to happen, is just, it's just ahistorical. I mean, we had a revolution that culminated in 1776. We had a revolution with the Civil War, and of course there'll be another revolution. The question is, you know, what can we do to make that revolution successful, to make the end goal be to the benefit of the majority? That's the question. Of course there'll be revolutions. There's revolutions going on all the time. Whoever makes it, whatever form it takes, there will be a revolution. That's just history.
Clay. Last question.
Unfortunately, my question is only for Studebaker. There's been a lot of talk, the entire panel, about actual existing socialism, but no one has brought up actually existing Platonism, because you mentioned Platypus. And of course, you and me both know that the real inheritors of the Platonic tradition are the 12er Shia Muslims.
Beautiful.
Yes, so my question is, because it's actually not an implicit but explicit thread within the history of Iran, Khomeini, like doing scholarship on Plato, and a major thread of clerical thought in Iran is about Platonism. They think they're doing the Republic, they think they're doing the Philosopher King. Like, why do you not defend the Islamic Republic of Iran?
Wonderful question.
The reason I don't defend the Islamic Republic of Iran is if you have Platonism by itself, in isolation, and then you mix it with a bunch of monotheistic religions that want to make it cataphatic and make a dogma of it and create a permanent state that is to exist at the national level for an extended period of time. If you do all of that, you become trapped in a form of life which is not capable of emancipating people from wage labor. And I think if you read Plato closely, and I'm working on this, it's not out yet, but if you read Plato closely, there is a critique of labor in Plato that the monotheistic Platonists of the Middle Ages, many of them didn't get, or they got it, but they assumed it could only be for a very small number of people, a restrictive priest class. This is in part why I think Marxism has to be mixed in here. There has to be a higher horizon for this kind of project than it tends to develop if it's left in sublime isolation. There's got to be some cross-pollination. When I talk to you guys, I go, hey guys, what about Plato and Hobbes? But if I was hanging out with Plato Platypus, okay, and don't think that these groups don't exist, you just don't know about them, okay? If I was hanging out with them, I would go, but you know, don't you think it might be possible for more people to not be stuck in a craft which alienates them from the good? Because of course in the Phaedrus he lists the crafts in order in terms of how much of a view the charioteer gets on the basis of what type of labor he's stuck in. I'd make those kinds of critiques if I had them to talk to tonight, but I don't. I have you, so I have to tell you what you should include that you don't presently include.
We have time. I'll take the last question. I'll take the last question. Let's do closing remarks. My question is, what is freedom?
Are we starting over at the beginning again?
Let's go.
No, I mean, with our discussion. Given the question you posed.
Seriously, man. Closing remarks. Come on.
Right. I'm sorry, I'm teasing.
How did we start?
Oh my God.
Yeah, for real.
Pass. Freedom is freedom. All right, I'm going to make a statement, but I'm not sure I believe in it. This is Schelling's view of freedom, and I think it's stronger than Hegel's. So if you could combine Marx with Schelling to have not a Platypus, but a Schellingopus, you'd be okay. In the Schellingopus, freedom is the ability to change your path, but not exclusively at your own will, and respond to the changes around you without losing any freedom.
Your turn. Thank you. Well, I'm glad we saved an easy one for last. My answer is, in all honesty, I don't know. In the same way we've been talking about how Marx is able to see the problems of capitalism and also is limited, because he is within it. I don't live in freedom. I don't think any of us do. I don't know what myself as a free person would look like, and I don't think I'll ever get to live to see it. So I don't know. But I'm currently striving towards its realization, And I hope that someday, maybe my grandchildren or great-grandchildren or the 3000 AD, I don't know, sort of space hybrids we have at that point, Posadism or whatever, will finally know what freedom is, but I certainly don't. And I think the people who claim to are often missing that ultimate freedom that we are all, or I would at least hope everyone in this room is striving towards. I don't know what it look like, but I know I want it.
Well, I'll go with the classic. Freedom is the recognition of necessity. And I think, what that means for us in thinking about the left and socialism and Marxism is what does the search for freedom, even if we can't exactly define it and we'll never know it fully in our lifetimes, what does that impose on us? So that's what I think freedom means today. Since it's closing remarks, I just want to thank the Platypus organizers. It's been a wonderful weekend. I've really appreciated all the discussion, and just thank you very much.
Freedom is the overcoming of a limit. So the way it looks is going to depend on what limits you face. Freedom could be not being in chains anymore and being free to run around. Freedom could be not having to go to work anymore and be able to dispose of the time. For freedom to be meaningful, you have to have some image of what you'll do with it. That image is going to be flawed and partial. It's going to be formed out of your experience of some kind of slavery, so it's not going to be that good. And after you're free, you're going to discover that your image of freedom is also limited and also a form of unfreedom. And then you'll have to discover the limits of that and then find some way to overcome those limits, and so on and so forth. But the thing that you're getting is not just freedom, it's your image of the life that you will live when you've been freed. That image that you have, as flawed and imperfect as it is what motivates you to strive for emancipation. If you don't think that you can do anything with not being in chains, there's no reason to not be in chains. There has to be something of value that you imagine you're gonna do. People who think that the only way that they can realize themselves is through their work don't struggle to overcome labor as a form. They just look for ways to make their working conditions better. You have to have an image. And yes, that image is crap. It's not that good. You're not that good. None of this is that good. So why would your image be all that great? But once we get to that image, then we can criticize it. But we won't just criticize it. We'll be criticizing it in view of the new image that we'll get. And that new image will be better. It won't just be freer. It will be better than the previous image. At least that's what I submit to you.
The only thing I can think of really is to characterize it as the free development of each in the context of the free development of all. That development is the becoming, the developing is the essential matter. Okay? I'll stop. Thank you.
Hi everyone, please no chatter for like 30 seconds. First of all, one more round of applause. This is the closing plenary of the meeting.